War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. For nearly all of recorded history, war was broken down into two levels, strategy and tactics. The etymology of the words reflect their ancient origins. Strategy comes from the ancient Greek strategia. All apologies to people who actually speak Greek and cringe at my pronunciations. It's literally Greek to me. Stra meant army and tegia meant to lead. So strategy directly translates to lead an army. Tactics came also from the Greek. Don't be surprised if we talk a lot about the Greeks and their influence on warfare in this podcast. Taktikos, meaning to arrange. Again, literally speaking, how to arrange the army. So from the very beginning, strategy was the what you wanted an army to do, and tactics was how you wanted an army to do it. Implied in these two terms is a subordination of tactics to strategy. Indeed, Sun Tzu said simply, tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. In other words, if you don't know what the hell you want your army to do, then how they do it is irrelevant at best and criminally negligent at worst. This ties in neatly with the other oft-quoted giant of military theory, Karl von Clausewitz, CVC for the cool kids. But before we dive into Clausewitz, we have to detour quickly into a discussion of another oft-used and arguably misused construct of strategy, the ends, ways, and means. The U.S. military almost necessitates an analysis of strategy through the lens of ends, ways, and means. Intuitively, the ends are the juice. Why are we doing this? What is the end state of this war or campaign, and how does that end state benefit us? For many who watched and fought in Afghanistan or Iraq, we question what the end state actually was. We will certainly go into more on ends when we discuss deliberate planning later. The means consist of the tools at our disposal to effect these ends. And the ways are literally the ways that we can use the means, also known as courses of action or COAs, to achieve the ends. You got it? If not, don't worry. You'll hear it again later. But that will be enough to quote Clausewitz on the relationship between tactics and strategy. Clausewitz explained, and I paraphrase, the means of tactics is battle. The ends of tactics are victory. The means of strategy are those tactical victories. The ends are the political objectives which initiated the conflict in the first place. For, again paraphrasing in the words of Clausewitz, war is policy, often said as politics, carried on by other means. And with this segue, we introduce another, higher level of warfare, that of policy. The government should, and I would argue must, but soldiers don't get to tell politicians what to do, have a clear-cut policy objective they wish to achieve by going to war. The American government publishes a national security strategy, which sets national policy objectives. From this document, the Secretary of Defense publishes a national defense strategy. Subordinate headquarters will then publish their strategy to support the national defense strategy. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs publishes the national military strategy. These three levels of strategy, and really the national security strategy is actually policy by definition, are said to be nested within each other. In other words, the defense strategy must directly support the national strategy. In my last job in the Army, working in the strategy, plans, and policy in D.C., I was thankful that this was not an annual process. A new administration may only publish one national security strategy. But every time a new national security strategy is published, then the defense strategy and military strategy must be rewritten to support it. All this to say that your tactics must support your strategy, and your strategy must support your policy. Now, in a confusing twist, there remains an even greater overarching level, which, in theory, should drive your policy. It sounds very impressive, if a bit confusing. Grand strategy. This can be defined as a long-term policy that would transcend administrations and provide a guiding philosophy for the conduct of the nation for the foreseeable future with an eye towards, but not necessarily limited to, countering, or defeating an enemy. This may impact military procurement. For example, a grand strategy of nuclear deterrence would necessitate the creation of a ballistic missile submarine fleet capable of striking an enemy in retaliation. It took decades for us to have a legitimate undersea nuclear deterrence. The obvious limitation here is while one administration may attempt to initiate a grand strategy, there is no requirement for follow-on administrations to adhere to it. Grand strategy should transcend mere military considerations as well. The simplistic but admittedly effective acronym the U.S. uses is DIME: Diplomacy, Information, Military, and Economic. These are called the instruments of national power. The aforementioned national security strategy should address all four of these. For a more practical example, if our grand strategy during the Cold War was the defeat of communism, our diplomatic strategy may revolve around mutual defense treaties, such as the famous NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the not-so-famous SEATO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. We developed the Voice of America to transmit pro-Western and anti-communist news behind the Iron Curtain. Economically, we made it a policy to not trade with communist nations, to weaken their economy, and limit their access to advanced Western technology. The Cold War was won because the U.S. and its allies effectively used a grand strategy and all the instruments of national power to defeat the Soviet Union. So, to recap for now, you have grand strategy, which drives policy. You have policy, which drives strategy, and you have strategy, which drives tactics. But, in the words of Yoda, there is another. One that straddles the admittedly wide gap between strategy and tactics, that of the operational art or operational level of war. You can blame the commies for this one. The Soviet Union formally created this level in the 1920s, learning from the lessons of World War I. In simpler days, the commanding general was almost invariably present at the battle itself. As armies and theaters became larger and larger, the commander was more and more removed from the battlefield, to where even hundreds of thousands of men fighting a battle may not have been seen by the commander. The advent of telegraph, telephone, and radio magnified that effect. To manage soldiers on the ground in the absence of physical presence required an adjustment to our thinking. I'd quote the U.S. military definition of operational art, but it doesn't help much. I recommend you look it up later. To simplify, or more accurately oversimplify it, if tactics is the battle itself and strategy is why the battle should happen, the operational art is getting the right resources to the battlefield to enact the tactics to bring victory on the battlefield, taking into account time, space, means, and purpose. It would be not inaccurate to say operational art is often a slave to logistics, but that again would oversimplify it. For a country as comfortably removed from its enemies as the United States fortunately is, getting the requisite force to where the battlefield is by far the greatest operational hurdle. And the U.S., particularly the U.S. Navy, is really good at it. So let's look at some non-military applications of the relationship of these concepts to other endeavors, starting with sports. One might say the strategy for a football team is the game plan, and the tactics are the plays. The tactical victories are the yards gained on offense or the stopping of the enemy's offense through defense. A team may have a strategy of being run-focused, so the tactics would reflect that. This ties into the concept of ends, ways, and means. Obviously, the end is victory. But if you have a particularly gifted running back as your means, then your ways would reflect that. You pound that rock. If you have a great quarterback and deep wide receiver core, then even if you wanted to be a run-heavy team, that would squander your advantage. Your strategy is to throw, and your plays or tactics would reflect that. On defense, the capabilities of your opponent and your own strengths and weaknesses on defense will develop that strategy accordingly. In boxing, probably the most famous strategy was Muhammad Ali's rope-a-dope against George Foreman. Ali was counted out of having any chance in this fight, but he developed a strategy to maximize his strengths, the means, and counter Foreman's. Foreman's power was unquestionable, foremost in Foreman's mind, but Ali had speed unseen in a heavyweight. Additionally, they were fighting in horrific heat for this rumble in the jungle. Foreman looked exhausted in a previous fight against Ronnie Lyle and could barely stand even in his victory in the 5th round. Ali was going to use his speed to counter the heavy-handed Foreman, lure him into sending haymaker after haymaker against Ali, who, while not the strongest puncher in boxing, probably had the best chin in history. Ali's chin and speed would deflect the worst of the attacks, and Ali would hope that the heat and exertion would make Foreman ripe for the falling. That was the strategy. The tactics were to counterpunch, not the normal stick-and-move Ali had made his reputation on, to rest on the ropes while Foreman threw his big punches, and rely on his head movement and deflections with his hands and arms to minimize the damage. Ali even challenged Foreman to hit him more and harder while on the ropes during the fight. A challenge Foreman foolishly accepted. Eventually, the stronger man was exhausted, and Ali marshaled his superior fitness and fast hands in a brutal beatdown that saw one Olympic gold medalist defeat another. A legendary fight, with a legendary strategy remembered, or at least reminded of in this case, even today. An MBA might associate policy with corporate strategy and strategy with a business strategy. What is the link between strategy and tactics from a business perspective? I think a good example recently would be Best Buy. Between the big box stores like Costco and internet sellers like Amazon, Best Buy was being strangled. They analyzed the ends, ways, and means, and their enemies, if we can use such a bellicose term here, and realized their weakness, being tied to a physical location and their relatively higher cost to other stores, could be an advantage if they could provide a better service rather than simply a cheaper cost. So they created the Geek Squad. They actually invested in training their sales staffs in the details of what they were selling. They invited vendors to become partners, or allies, if you will, developing showrooms within the physical location. These could be described as their tactics supporting the strategy. Now, Best Buy did not defeat their enemies. The fight goes on, but it provides an example of the linkage between tactics and strategy in business. The operational art in the Best Buy example could be seen as reaching out to the vendors and establishing what they were trying to do, developing the training programs, how long to train, what to train them on. The Geek Squad was a stunning invention and branding opportunity of providing top quality service to their customers. The development of that could be seen as the execution of an operational level, bridging the strategy of great service with the tactic of providing that service to the homes of their customers. And these are initial, relatively sterile doctrinal discussions that lay the foundation for future podcasts. We often neglect talking about the enemy, but in reality, the enemy must always be foremost in your mind, analyzing his ends, ways, and means, dissecting his strategies, learning his strengths and weaknesses, which must always shape your own strategic analysis. Any policy, strategy, or tactic must be developed with an eye towards your antagonist, never in isolation. Certainly, every step Ali and Best Buy took, their opponents were filling their thoughts. Sun Tzu: if you know yourself and know your enemy, in 100 battles, you need not fear the outcome. We went over a lot today. The levels of war, grand strategy, policy, strategy, operations, and tactics. We discussed the instruments of national power, or DIME. We discussed all too briefly ends, ways, and means. We listed, but really didn't talk about the operational considerations of space, time, means, and purpose. We will return to these subjects in more depth later, I can assure you. But a brief introduction was necessary to allow us to continue our journey. A general awareness will suffice for now. If you can't wait for the details, more information is an internet search away. And that should hold you over until next time when we dive into Karl von Clausewitz. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit. And check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.